empty can reward. Can someone help me with the significance? I take that as, it says, to Dan Chambers, for the ability to teach and encourage many at the Concord Road Church of Christ. Now that's good. So far, so good, right? So far, so good. Dan is the worthy recipient of this empty can award. I don't know what, it went from sounding good to sounding bad. I don't know. Maybe that's it. Oh, good, I'll take it like that. Is it? I can pull something out of nothing. I don't know if that's good. Okay, let's see if we can fill up this empty can. Why don't we? We'll take it that way. Okay, we're in the book of Joshua. Now, we have been through chapter 10. We're going to go into chapter 11 tonight. And the nature of Joshua is going to change after tonight. It's going to go from exciting narrative to crushingly numb descriptions of the settlement of the Promised Land. So it's going to change a little bit. But that doesn't mean there's not important things in those other things. But it means we're going to take big leaps. After tonight, we'll have like 4 more weeks left in Joshua. And because if you've been kind of looking at this thing and going, I don't know if we're going to finish Joshua chapter 24. We've only got 4 weeks after it. No, we're going to finish it because the nature of it changes after tonight. And so we'll be taking big chunks, like 4 or 5 chapters, and making some observations. And you're thinking, what's next? I know what you're thinking. What's next? After Joshua, we did Numbers. And we got the children of Israel out of Egypt. We got them through the wilderness. We got them to the edge of the Promised Land. We did Joshua now. We're getting them into the Promised Land, the Conquest. What next? And you're thinking, the book of Judges. That's next. Well, kinda, but no. Why I say that is this. What I'm going to do is we've got 2 more lessons on Sunday morning in 2 Thessalonians, 2 more lessons on that. And then we're going to start a new series, and I'm going to, for the first time in my 33-year ministry, I'm going to do a sermon series from the book of Judges instead of doing it in a class setting. So I am pumped about that. I just bought $200 worth of books on Judges today from Amazon. And as though I didn't have enough already, but I said, I can't wait any good excuse to add more tools to the tool chest. And so I'm looking we are going to do Judges, but not in class. Don't know exactly yet what we're going to do starting the next quarter in December after we finish the book of Joshua, but it's going to be great, whatever it is, whatever we choose. But I do want to let you know that we are going to do the book of Judges. You're the first to know that we're going to do, that's the next expository sermon series, the book of Judges. Okay, so Joshua chapter 11. We were in 10, of course, last week as we spent a great deal of time looking at the last part of chapter 10 that really describes the Israelites and Joshua's conquest of southern Palestine. And we kept looking at a recurring statement that all of the city-states that the Israelites came up against, they completely annihilated the cities. And not a soul was left alive. And so what we did last week, we spent our time with that section because it's, a lot of people obviously consider it to be a difficult text. The concept of holy war there. And so we spent our time looking at that. And we said if you read that in isolation from the rest of the Old Testament, it can be a pretty acute problem. And so context is very, very important. And so we put it in the larger context of the Old Testament. And we saw that the Bible doesn't deal with the death of the Canaanites in an arbitrary or flippant way. but it prepares the reader all the way back in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 16 for this moment. And it's there that it reveals the Amorites and how the Amorites had 400 years to change their ways, and they didn't. And really the Bible takes pains to show that the people of Canaan are involved in repulsively immoral acts and behavior. And so what we have here as we come to Joshua chapter 10 is, not this, this God-ordained hate mission. It's not that, but what it is, as we said last week, it is divine judgment. It is divine judgment on sin. It's the same thing that God has been carrying out from time to time since the Garden of Eden. It's the same thing that God will do ultimately on a universal scale at the end of time. And the Israelites were simply the instruments by which God carried out his judgment on the Amorites. So we spent time, our whole time last week was really discussing that, which is a great worthy discussion. Now what I want to do is as we get into chapter 11, we're going to move. Now southern Palestine, the southern Promised Land, region of the Promised Land, has been largely conquered, and now the Israelites are going to turn north, and there's going to be a northern campaign. And so with the northern campaign, let's take a look. Let's just begin to read, and then we're going to make some observations. Then it came about, when Jabin, the king of Hatzor, heard of it, that he sent to Jobab, the king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Akshaph, and to the kings who were in the north of the hill country, and in the Arabah, south of Kinneroth, and in the lowland, and on the heights of Dor on the west, to the Canaanite on the east, and on the west, and the Amorite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Jebusite in the hill country, the Hivite at the foot of Hermon in the land of Mizpah. They came out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. So all these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Okay, so as Israel turns their attention to the north, the kings of the north, of all these city-states in the north, they know all about the Israelites. They know all about the successes of the Israelites. They're not living in a vacuum. They're living in that context, in that setting. News travels fast. And they know what the Israelites have done in the southern part of the land. And what they've done is, from a military perspective, is just overwhelming. And so the word reaches the kings of the north, these city-states in the areas of Galilee and westward, and they decide, they have to take action to protect their territory. And so the leader of this coalition, he's mentioned there in verse 1, is Jabin, or Jabin, who is the king of Hatzor. Now it looks like in terms of... most scholars say that Jabin or Jabin is not really a personal name. It's probably a dynastic title. And the reason is you're going to see that title pop up with other rulers. Take a look, for instance, in the book of Judges. Turn over to Judges chapter 4. You'll see it here, of course. The sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died, and the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, or Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. This is not the same one, but Jabin, you'll see it there. Turn over to Psalm chapter 83. Psalm chapter 83. And when you get there, look at about verse 9. Psalm 83. Let's see. Getting down to verse 9. Deal with them as with Midian, as with Sisera and Jabin at the torrent of Kishon. And so you see this name pop up in some other places. And so that's one of the reasons why most scholars say this appears to be or not really so much a personal name, but a dynastic name. But he's the king of Hatzor. And as we think about, the king of Hatzor, what we're talking about here is we're talking about a city that was vast in size. I mean, vast. It was at the head of, in fact, look at verse 10 of chapter 11 of Joshua. Then Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hatzor and struck its king with the sword, for Hatzor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms. And so the text tells us here that the city of Hatzor was the prominent city. It was the kind of the default city in charge, and we know that from its size. What we know, that tells us, just that statement there tells us it's going to be a big city. And we do know from the excavations of Hatzor that have taken place that it was a big place, a really big place. We're talking about 200 acres. And to put that in perspective, do any of you remember what the size of the ancient city, the ancient tell of Jericho was in terms of acreage? Does anybody remember that when we talked about that? It's been a while back. No, it was about 10. It was about 10. And Ai, does anybody remember Ai? What? It was a little less than 4 acres. It was more around the 3 acre, 2.5, 3 acre. And which certainly is reflected in the biblical text, because remember when the people left after the city of Jericho and they went up to Ai, the reconnaissance team, the scouts came back and said, "Oh, we don't need the whole army here. We just need a small army." It wasn't a big city, and sure enough, where I believe Ai is located today, was a fortified city, but only about 3 acres or so. We're talking about a couple of 100 acres at Hatzor. And so as we think about a city that size, you're really talking about a city that could support a population of 30,000 people. It is a big city in ancient days. It's a great place to go, and oftentimes we stop there at Hatzor. I haven't stopped at Hatzor with a group in a long time, but after studying Joshua, when we go back the next trip, I told you several of you have asked, and we got it on the books for April of 2023, so about 18 months from now. As we go north into Galilee, we're going to stop at Hatzor this time again. It's been ages since I've been at Hatzor. It's one of the great sites, and it's just a vast city. And so as Jabin was the leader, was the king there at this great royal city of Hatzor. And so as we see how this is all going to unfold, we see this massive coalition here in verse 4. Take a look at verse 4. Look at the way it's described. They came out, all of these cities that was led by Hatzor. And I just told you, the size of Hatzor was enormous for an ancient city, supporting a massive population. And when you combine that with all these other city-states, you've got, it says, when they came out, they and all their armies with them, as many as people as the sand that is on the seashore. In other words, you know what that means. It's a figurative way of saying it was a vast army. And not only was it a vast army in terms of numerical strength, but it was a very highly advanced army in terms of technology. And you see that at the end of verse 4. Look at it, after it says the people were as vast as the sand of the seashore, it says, with very many horses and chariots. Israel is coming up against an absolute juggernaut. But again, not just the size of the army, but this technology. This is cutting-edge warfare. What we know about chariot warfare at this particular time in history, it was a style of fighting, and these chariots that they're talking about would have been chariots that are very light and very fast. They were very mobile chariots. And, they weren't, sometimes when you kind of get a picture of chariots, you get a picture of these you kind of see in your mind these big, massive, and it's almost like a tank force. Well, this wouldn't have been like that. These were light, fast, maneuverable instruments. And so what the typical way of fighting wars among people like this who had the size and the wealth to be able to bring this technology to bear, there were two things that made this such an effective weapon system. Number one was the chariot that they designed that, again, was very light, very fast, very mobile. And then they combined it with an equally impressive weapon, and that was the composite bow. And how they did it was these chariots were very time-consuming to make. They were very expensive to make. It was a very expensive task and prospect, and so it was really only a luxury that city-states, that nation-states, who had a lot of political and economic power, that they could that you would find it there, and so you had a driver and you had an archer in these chariots, and the way that chariot warfare was done. Both the chariots and archers usually came from the elite class of people, and what they would do is they would actually disassemble the chariots and carry them to a base of operations, because these chariots were just by their nature of being a very light, fast piece of equipment. They weren't designed. They were in a way, in one sense, they were really delicate and extremely valuable because of the cost of making them. And so it was very risky to make a long journey in them. That it could disable the weapon system before they ever got to the area of operation. And so they would typically disassemble the chariots, and when they got there at camp, they would assemble them in this fixed camp, and then they were dispatched in waves. It was really a coordinated assault force. You had infantry, and then you had these chariots and archers. And what these chariots and archers would do is they would try to outflank the enemy. They would go around the enemy, and these squadrons of chariots, and they would just loop in and out, come into range and go out of range, come into range and out of range of enemy archers, and they were so fast they would swoop in, and the archers in those fast-moving chariots would just unleash everything, and then as they peeled off, then another wave, another squadron of chariots would come in. And this had a devastating effect, especially on armies that didn't possess the same technology. And so as we read verse 4, it sets up a situation where, if you're just kind of looking at things on the surface, you're going to think, there is just no way that Israel, who does not have a force, they don't have chariots and they don't have horses, that they're going to stand a chance against this army who has this kind of weapons technology and this size described here in verse 4 as the sand that is on, as many as the sand that is on the seashore. So that's what Israel's up against here in verse 4. And so we come to verse 6 then, as we set this up, and God comes to Joshua as they're facing this kind of army. And God says to Joshua, do not be afraid because of them. See, God had to tell him that would make anyone normally afraid because they're outnumbered and they're outgunned. And so, that's kind of, that's a tall order there. And so God reassures Joshua, no, you don't have to be afraid because of them, for tomorrow I will deliver all of them, he says. All of them slain before Israel, you shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. I'm going to deal with all of it. You are going to, it is going to be a lopsided victory. And I'm going to deliver you. I'm going to wipe them out. You're going to take all of this weapons technology and you're going to destroy it. You're going to hamstring the horses. What's that mean? Do you know what that means? Okay. Yeah, that's right. Sam said, cut the tendon. That is exactly what they cut the tendon of the leg, and it prevents them from ever pulling a chariot again. He said, you shall hamstring the horses, and you will burn the chariots with fire. Now, why in the world would you do that? I mean, do you think the Taliban did that with the billions of dollars of military equipment we left in Afghanistan? No. You don't do that. Now you got an army, and you don't get rid of that. But God said, get rid of it. Why, David? That is exactly right. If you didn't hear David, he brought up the fact that God wants his people to trust him. And he didn't want them to think for 1 second that their victory came because of might, because of numbers, because of weapons technology. He wanted them to understand without a doubt that victory came from the Lord. And let's look at a couple of passages where you're going to see that emphasized. Turn over to Deuteronomy 17. These are a couple of good verses. If you like to write these things in your Bible, and there by verse 4 or verse 6 there, that you shall hamstring the horses and burn the chariots. This is a good little reference to write there. Deuteronomy chapter 17, look at verse 16. Look at verse 14. It starts this way. Remember, when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you shall possess it and live in it, you shall say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. And then he kind of goes down, and he says, verse 16, moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. You see this kind of language, and you see it in different places. God doesn't want his people to depend on those things. He wants his people to depend on him. And so that's why, obviously, I think it's pretty obvious, that's why he would tell his people to do that. You're going to depend on me. I will make a promise. I will fulfill that promise. And that's what he does. And so as we go back to Joshua chapter 11 then, it says, verse 7, so Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom and attacked them. Verse 8, the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as great Sidon and I won't even try to pronounce that. and the valley of Mizpah to the east, and they struck them until no survivor was left of them. Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses. He burned their chariots with fire. Then verse 10 says he turned back at that time and captured Hatzor, struck its king with the sword, for Hatzor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms. So we also learned something here about Hatzor. So this great city that encompassed almost 200 acres was taken, and it was burned with fire, verse 11 says. Now, I haven't decided if I want to take the time to do it. We did it with Jericho. We did kind of an archaeological class on the destruction of Jericho a few weeks ago, and then we did the same thing with Ai. I might next week, I'll see, do some stuff on Hatzor. But one of the neat things about Hatzor, this is only the third city. This is the third city that Israel burns. That was not the habit of burning all the cities. In fact, you continue to read on. Look at verse 12. So verse 10 says, or verse 11 says that he burned Hatzor with fire. Verse 12 says, Joshua captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword, utterly destroyed them, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds, except Hatzor alone, which Joshua burned. And all the spoil of these cities and the cattle and the sons of Israel took as their plunder, but they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. They left no one who breathed. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. And so the same process that they carried out in the south, they carry out now in the north, but the only city that they burn is the city of Hatzor. And one of the things that we know from all the excavations at Hatzor is there is just like at Jericho and just like at Ai, there is a massive ash layer that dates to about this time. And that shows that the entire city was burned. And it's pretty neat, as you look at that and as you see that ash layer as they were excavating and revealed this pervasive ash layer, this massive conflagration that was at that massive city, which seems to clearly reflect this statement here, the fire that destroyed Hatzor. So we see then the cities, as he mentions them all, they captured them all, they wiped them out. Then in verse 16, Joshua took all that land, the hill country, all the Negev, the land of Goshen, the lowland, the Arabah, the hill country of Israel, its lowland. And it says from Mount Halak that rises toward Seir, even as Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon at the foot of Mount Hermon. He captured all their kings, struck them down, put them to death. He waged war a long time with these kings. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel, except the Hivites living in Gibeon. We know all about the Gibeonites. They took them all in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts to meet Israel in battle, in order that he might utterly destroy them and that they might receive no mercy, but he might destroy them just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Okay, let's take a look at this now. As we look at this, I want you, and it summarizes this utter victory, this complete victory of the northern part of the Promised Land. We come to this interesting statement that's made in verse 20. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, to meet Israel in battle, in order that he might utterly destroy them. As we look at this kind of answers the why question. And what I mean by the why question is, at least it's partially answered here. Why did the Canaanite chiefs consider Israel to be such a threat and to meet them in battle? Well, obviously, part of the reason they considered it is because they knew everything that was going on in the southern part of the Promised Land. But I think verse 20 here of chapter 11 offers some more insight into the why. And I think what it suggests is that it was a God thing. That God, for lack of a better word, goaded them into this war. He goaded the Canaanites into a conflict for the purpose of destroying them. Some people would find that troubling. And my question to you is, why might someone find that? It almost looks like they didn't have free will here. And that troubles some people. They go, I thought that people have free will. But when you read like this language here, it's like God was manipulating the whole thing. What do you say about that? Mac? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think Mac's absolutely right. A couple of things. He mentions, of course, when we look at this, hardening hearts, a lot of people their mind doesn't go to Joshua chapter 11 and go, oh, wait a minute, God hardened hearts, people. No, it always goes to Pharaoh. Over in Exodus chapter 14. Take a look at Exodus chapter 14. This story, it's just so familiar to us. Exodus chapter 14, down in verse 17. This is at the parting of the Red Sea. Verse 13, Moses says to the people, stand by, see the salvation of the Lord, which you'll accomplish today. The Lord's going to fight for you, verse 14. And so he says, lift up your staff, verse 16, stretch out your hand over the sea, divide it. The sons of Israel will go through in the midst of the sea on dry land. As for me, God says, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. Sometimes we might think, why in the world did the Egyptians do that? You put them you put yourself in their place, and you see these waters suddenly open up. That doesn't happen naturally. And there's these two great walls, and there's this corridor running through, and the Israelites are going through it. I'm going to guess that most people would go, I ain't going in there. The people who were pursuing them, they would, wait a minute, their God is obviously powerful. I'm not following them in there. We're gonna let them go. What possessed them after seeing this, after seeing their God, Israel's God, Yahweh, do that? What would make them go in there? God did. That's what it says here in verse 17. As for me, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. God just overruled everything. God took them in there to destroy them. And so, when we think of this language and we see this language, another place where you kind of see this kind of God working to harden hearts and change people's minds to rig the game. Another one will be in 1 Kings. Take a look at 1 Kings chapter 22. 1 Kings chapter 22. When the prophet Micaiah predicts Ahab's defeat, you take a look at it down about verse 19. Micaiah said, therefore, hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on a throne and all the hosts of heaven standing by him on his right and his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab to go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said this while another said that. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, I'll entice him. And the Lord said to him, how? And he said, I will go out and be a deceiving spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. Then he said, you are to entice him and to prevail. Go and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a deceiving spirit in the mouth of all your prophets, and the Lord has proclaimed disaster against you. And so you have this picture of God using this malevolent spirit to bring down the king of Israel. So this is not unusual. Well, it's not like real common, but it's Pharaoh's not the only case where you see that. But what you see in every case is, and Tim mentioned this, or Tim, I saw your hand, that's why I said, I'll just say, Mac mentioned this. What's important in all of these cases is that there has already been a pattern of obstinacy established in these people. He's not taking people whose hearts are soft, that could be opened with the right persuasion. God knows their hearts, and we have their hearts revealed to us. And so this pattern of obstinacy has already been established, and God just uses them to accomplish his purpose. Tim. Yeah, you're exactly right. He mentions Romans chapter 1, same pattern. The only thing is about that, it might be a tad different, a tad. What I mean by that is, if you look at verse 24 of Romans chapter 1, when it describes what's being done here, verse 21, for even though they knew God, they didn't honor him as God or give thanks. They became futile in their speculation. Their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds, of four-footed animals, crawling creatures. Therefore, now the therefore is important. Paul's going to explain why God acted the way he acted toward them. He's just explained because of this. They have rejected him completely. And so it says, therefore God gave them over in the lust of their heart to impurity so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. And it kind of goes on. So this whole idea of God giving them over in the lust of their heart. The word lust there basically means a strong desire. It could be used in a good sense. It could be used in an evil sense, but of impurity. God gave them over. He gave them over to the idols that they are pursuing. The picture here that we see is one more of, and this is the idea, this is why I say it's about maybe a little bit different. The picture here is that the idea that God's people is under his protective care. That we call on God, we seek his protective care. He gives his protective care. And we're under his protective care until we're not. Sometimes he gives us up. Sometimes he gives us up. And you can kind of see that concept in Matthew 6:13. You can see it in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. I don't think we really know how much God has restrained us from destroying ourselves. And we're not even aware of it, of just how protective God has been for us. And he's kept us from destroying ourselves with our own folly. And so this is saying that there comes a time when God withdraws his restraint. And I can't imagine anything more frightening than that concept. That there comes a time in a person's rebellion where God will withdraw his restraint. And that's why I say this might be a little bit different, because I think here you have more of a picture of God withdrawing his protective restraint. Whereas in those other things that we've seen, whether it was Pharaoh or whether it is, here in Joshua chapter 11, and with this coalition of kings, you have here more of God directly causing them to do something. And so God is still active and involved in each one, but it's just a different approach here. Carl.
In that line, we just studied 2 Thessalonians.
Mm-hmm.
Chapter 2, when it's talking about the Lord coming, and he's going to, and some are going to perish because of the activity of Satan.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who perish because they did not receive the love of the truth so as to be saved.
Mm-hmm.
For this reason, God will send upon them a deluding influence,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so that they will believe what is false.
Yes.
In order that they may all be judged,
Mm-hmm.
who did not believe the truth, but took pleasure in wickedness.
Yep.
So they don't like the truth.
They don't like it.
They do know what they do like is
Mm-hmm.
wickedness.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to do it.
Yep.
God is not going to be my God.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That
So God sends the
perfect.
confusion and other hearts hardened.
Yeah. It is a judicial hardening. It is a judicial hardening. And thank you, Carl. That is the perfect verse. That's the perfect passage of judicial hardening. And, the dynamic there in 2 Thessalonians 2, we could discuss and a little bit more, but it is exactly what it's saying. It is judicial hardening. Now, I also, though, there is real similarities, I think, there with the whole Pharaoh episode and the Coalition Kings episode. But I would even venture out and say, what though you saw, you got real judicial hardening that goes on even today. When people are stubborn and resistant and obstinate, God will, allow their hard hearts, whether it's removing his protective influence or however he chooses to do it, he will harden them as a judicial act. He will harden them in their state that will not respond to him because they don't have any interest. They don't love the truth. They don't have any. But when you look at these things in Judges chapter 11, and these things fall in that same, all this falls in the same exact category. And certainly there, because as we said about Pharaoh, what you have here is a pattern of obstinacy clearly established. But these are what you have in this example in Joshua and what you had in the case of Pharaoh, I think. It shows us, especially when it comes to the question of free will. And people ask about that in its relationship. Number one, the answer is, like we just said, it's judicial hardening. There's already a pattern of obstinacy been established. But second of all, you say, it's also fair to say, God does respect people's free will. Normally. God created people with the capacity to make a choice, and he respects the integrity of his own creation, and that means he lets people make choices, and whatever the consequences, good or bad, he allows it to unfold. If God didn't do that, then he wouldn't even be respecting the integrity of his own creation. God normally does that. But at the same time that God does that, he is sovereign. And he has a purpose, and he has a plan. And if God ever wants to step in and intervene, and directly manipulate someone on a particular occasion for the accomplishment of his purposes, God can do that. And he does it. And these are instances of that. I think God is just, he is, he's fulfilling his plan. His plan, ultimately, it's part of the plan of ultimate redemption of humanity, but the establishment of his people Israel. And so God has the sovereign right to sometimes step in if he wants to suspend free will on an occasion for a particular purpose, for his glory and for his purpose. God can certainly do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. Mac, I saw your hand again. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. God did use Judas, but Judas made his own choices there. And God chose to use Judas in his rebellion on that occasion. Yeah, I saw some more hands.
We said last week in Genesis and Leviticus, it's not like this was an overnight deal.
Yeah, that's right.
God had shown them 400 years prior to this. You had 400 years to get it right.
Yep, that's exactly right. And so as God is purging the promised land, as he is, as he is delivering a message to Egypt and all the surrounding nations of his greatness, Pharaoh would have let the children of Israel go earlier than they did, than he actually did, because God still had some lessons to teach. And so he took a man whose heart was hard, his obstinate was set against God, but God said, I'm going to just, I got some more things to do, and which ultimately led up to that destruction of the Red Sea. Other hand, I thought I saw some other hands. Who did the other hand? Yes, Anita. Yeah. I will be honored. That's exactly right. I will be honored. And it did honor him. It showed his strength, his power over Pharaoh, over the greatest army on the face of the earth. Other questions, comments, observations? Yeah, Brad. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And you see it, for instance, like Acts 5, Ananias and Sapphira. Okay, he normally, when someone lies, doesn't go, he doesn't do that. But on that particular occasion, he had a lesson to teach to his church. So he stepped in, and he did that. And that's his sovereignty. That's his sovereignty at work to accomplish his purpose. Yeah. Okay, real quickly, where time is up, but as we think about the work of God here, that's, I think, the main lesson here is the power, the sovereignty of God. I see that here. That's one of the main lessons. And of course, the other main lesson that we just continue to come back to is that the power of God is amazing. As Joshua and the Israelites are facing that, there is nothing too big for God, and we need to remember that. There is nothing too big for God. With God on our side, we will be victorious. And the second thing in that same kind of picture that I want to emphasize before we quit, or it would be terribly amiss not to do so, not only the power of God, the faith of Joshua. He said, Joshua, don't be afraid. I'm going to give him. I'm going to give him to you. And Joshua never did say, well, listen, can you give me a sign of that? Can you let me have a sign? Or can you give me some additional arms? I believe you, but can we have some additional arms? No. God said, I'm doing this, and Joshua had faith. And so those are two of the overwhelming themes that we continue to see: the power of God and the necessity of faith in his people. All right, thanks for being here. Just really appreciate it. Let's have a real quick word of prayer, and then I'll cut you loose. Father, it is wonderful to be here. What a blessing it is to see you in action, in your sovereignty, in your power, your omniscience, your omnipotence, your omnipresence. Lord, we are overwhelmed by your power, and I pray that all of us, as we watch these great stories of the past unfold, that we'll take them into our heart and that we will honor you as the sovereign, all-powerful God, that we'll always trust you just like Joshua, Father. Thank you for giving us evidence to hold on to in our days. And Father, I just pray that we'll take this evidence to heart and hold so tightly to you. Thank you for Jesus. We know the victory is through him ultimately, and it's in his name we pray. Amen. Thank you for being here. Have a great rest of the week. Lord willing, I'll see you Sunday.